If you have a child that wants to get into Melbourne High, Mac.Rob, Nossal, or Suzanne, Cory, then on the selective entry exam that they'll have to sit, they'll need to score in the top 15%. And so the question that naturally comes from that is, what can you do to give your child the best possible chance of being a part of this top 15% here, rather than the bottom 85% who unfortunately don't get accepted into these schools? Now, over the last 12 months, I've helped hundreds of students prepare for the selective entry exam. I also went to a selective entry school myself, and I went through the process of sitting this exam. And throughout all of that, I've seen three key things that the top students do that really differentiates themselves from everyone else and allows them to be in that top 15%, like you can see here on screen, compared to that bottom 85% of students who really struggle and ultimately don't get into one of these schools. Now, the best way to understand, well, what do the top students do and how does that differ to everyone else, is firstly by actually looking at what do most people do? What do most people who sit for this exam do? And how can you then do something slightly different to get an edge on everyone else? So what most people do is, the reality is that a lot of people who sit this exam, they are quite smart. And a lot of people think, well, I'm getting top grades at school, I'm towards the top of my class, you might have been called out in gifted or talented programs. And so one of the traps that a lot of students fall into is they think, I'm getting really high grades at school, I'm naturally talented, I'm naturally gifted with a high IQ, and that's quite a lot on its own. And that's going to be enough to get me into one of these schools on its own. I don't really need to do any more practice. This is a key thing that happens to a lot of people. They think, I'm already doing well, I'm getting a high scores at school, I've got a high IQ, I'm already in gifted and talented programs, that's probably enough, I'll just naturally do well on this exam. But unfortunately, that's not really the case, because everyone who's sitting this exam, they are all towards the top of their class, they're all getting pretty good grades, they all have higher than average IQs most likely. This alone isn't really something that's going to differentiate your child. It's not going to be the thing that's going to get them in the top 15% and going to allow them to stand out. Second thing, a lot of people think, well, I can just attend tutoring classes. If I do tutoring from now until the exam, that's going to give my child a massive advantage over everyone else. The reality is that yes, tutoring is very important, and most students who do sit this exam, they do get tutoring. But because of that fact, it's not going to be the thing that's going to differentiate your child. I would say if they don't get tutoring, it is going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. I know when I went to Melbourne High, once I actually got to the school and spoke with everyone there, I was shocked at how many people did get tutoring. People got tutoring from year 3, from year 4, from really young ages to prepare for this exam. People didn't just sort of prepare a few days beforehand. But getting tutoring alone is not going to be enough to differentiate you into that top 15%. It's important, yes, but it's not going to be the difference maker on its own. Third thing, a lot of people think, well, let's get some practice questions. Let's buy practice question books. Let's get resources. Let's get as many practice questions as we can do and do heaps of practice questions in the lead up to the exam. And very similar to the first two, yes, it definitely does help if you're doing well at school, if you've got a high IQ. Yes, it definitely does help if you're getting tutoring. And practice questions are very important as well. But everyone really knows that. And so most people do a significant amount of practice questions in the lead up to the exam. And for that reason, it's normally not the difference maker as well. It's normally not the difference between students who are in the bottom 85% who don't get offers compared to the top 15% of people who get into Melbourne High, Mac.Rob, Nossal, and Suzanne, Cory. The final thing then is starting preparation early. Now, this is something that I thought personally would be a big difference maker. If I start my preparation pretty early, that's going to give me a big advantage. But like I mentioned, when I got to the school, I realized just how early people started preparing. From year 3 and year 4, they started thinking about moving ahead of the current curriculum. When they're in year 4, learning end of year 4 content, early year 5 content, same thing in year 5. And so people start thinking about this exam pretty early on. And so starting early is definitely a massive advantage, and it will increase your chances of success most likely, but it's not going to be the difference maker most likely on its own. And so the key thing here is, yes, these 4 key things, natural talent and IQ, attending tutoring classes, doing lots of practice questions, and starting early, they are important, and they are something that really we probably should do if you want to maximize your chances of success. But because everyone knows that they are important, they're normally not the difference makers. They're not the thing that's going to elevate your child, give them an edge, give them an unfair advantage, and get them in the top 15% of students. And so over the last year, over the last few years, both from running a tutoring company that helps students get into these selective schools, but also going through the process myself of sitting the exam, getting accepted into Melbourne High, like you see here on screen, and then working with a lot of students, like I mentioned, over the last 12 months, helping them get into these schools as well. There's 3 key things that I've seen do make the difference, that are the difference between students who are in the bottom 85% and they don't get accepted compared to the ones who wake up and they've got offers from Melbourne High, Mac.Rob, Nossal, and Suzanne, Cory. Now, the first one of these is exam strategy. Because the key thing is that learning the right strategy or technique can allow your child to get 2-minute questions correct in 30, 45 seconds, or go from being inconsistent in their writing to getting 9, 10 out of 10 every single time without much stress or fuss. And what I mean by exam strategy is every year on the selective entry exam, there's a number of questions that appear year after year after year. There's a number of topics that come up on the exam very regularly. In maths, in reading, in verbal reasoning, in quantitative reasoning, even in writing, there's same types of prompts, same types of questions that come up year after year. And if your child knows the strategies and techniques for how to solve those questions, it essentially means they'll go from being in the dark, just sort of randomly doing it, to having a set method. They see that question, they know I need to apply this technique, and that's going to allow them to get the question correct with more accuracy, but also, and more importantly, with more speed. Speed is a big part of this exam. Let's have a look at 3 questions just to see what this means. So this here is an example question that comes up on the verbal reasoning section of the exam pretty often, I would say. And it says here, in preparation for an event, 5 decorators were assigned the same number of rooms to decorate for the day. Barbara finished her work before Frank, but after Emily. David finished 2 spots earlier than Grace, who was after Frank, who finished their work first. Now, what most people do when they first try to solve this is they try and figure it out in their head. The reality is that under the stress of exam day, when there's a lot of pressure, you've got a lot of nerves, it's going to be very hard to consistently get this question correct. This is not even the hardest version of this question. It does get significantly harder than this. And so you do need a method. You need a method. If you want to get this right in about 20 seconds, which is all you've got, 20, 30 seconds, you need to have a method that you follow. In this case, the method that we recommend is something called logic tables. And so you draw out a little table like this, because you do have access to pen and paper in the exam, and you plot the information that you read into this table. Because the reality is that all the information is here. We just have to plot it in a way that's simple so we can find out who did finish their work first. And so all we need to do is we just label this first here. We label this last over here. And we then plot the information as we go through it. So 5 decorators were assigned the same number of rooms to decorate for the day. So it says here, Barbara finished her work before Frank. So we don't exactly know where they were in the order, but we know that Barbara finished her work before Frank. So I'm just going to leave a bit of space in between just in case they're not exactly next to each other. But Barbara, she definitely finished her work before Frank. We know that for certain. But she finished after Emily. And so Emily was before her. I'm going to do that here. So we know Emily was first so far, then Barbara, then Frank. David finished 2 spots earlier than Grace, who was after Frank. So Grace is after Frank. So she would be here. And then David finished 2 spots earlier than Grace, so here. And said who finished their work first? Well, it was, of course, Emily. And so the correct answer there was A. And so you can see, when you just try and read it in your head and try and get to the right answer, it's pretty hard. I would not be able to do it, realistically, just in my head. But once you plot it out in the table, it's very easy. And even when this question gets harder and there's more people added, or there's more difficulty, or there's more confusing elements added to the question, as long as you plot it out in a table, it doesn't really matter how hard the question gets, you're still going to be able to get it right. And so this is a good example where exam strategy is important. You could do 100 of these questions, and if you didn't know the exam strategy, you're not going to improve that much. As soon as you know how to actually solve it, you can probably do 10, and you should be able to master it and get it right every single time. So this here's another example, which is called translating languages. Now you probably noticed a lot of these questions, they're not really similar to what you'll do at school. Some questions are, but there is a lot of questions like these ones here where it's not something you would have seen at school before. So the following words are translated to English from an obscure language. Luna Sotra means moonlight. Sotra Finde means light bulb. And Verde Sotra means green moon. Which word could mean green light? Now, same thing again with this one. You could do 100 questions and you could not really improve and not actually learn how to answer these questions very effectively compared to if you know the exam strategy, they're very easy to solve. Now, the strategy for this one is firstly, look for what's common, then look for what's not common. So the first thing we want to say is what is in common? What is in common here? Both the first and the last ones have moon in them. So when we say what's common, moon is common between both of these. And so that means we need something that's common here as well. We can see here what's common, Sotra and Sotra. And so lunar Sotra means moonlight and Verde Sotra means green moon. And so that tells us one thing. If moon is repeated both times here and Sotra is repeated both times here, what does moon mean in the foreign language? Of course it means Sotra because it's repeated both times just like moon is. So we know that Sotra equals moon. Now the reason why that's important is because that actually tells us the green is Verde and lunar is light. And so we know the correct answer, which word could mean green light, it has to be Verde lunar. So this is the wrong way around, light equals lunar. It needs to be Verde lunar or lunar Verde. And in this case here we can see this one. Verde lunar is correct. And that's really just because we look for what's common. Now sometimes you'll need more information, so then you'll need to look for what's not common, which is kind of what we did there when we looked at these two ones here. But that's a key strategy. Once you understand that strategy, you can probably do 10 or 20 of these questions and you can get pretty confident with them. But if you didn't have the strategy, you could do hundreds of them and you could still not really improve at all. Now, one final example, number patterns. This one here again is one where a lot of people will find it extremely difficult if they don't understand the strategy behind it. Have a look at this one here. See if you can find what the pattern is. This is probably a moderately difficult pattern question. It's one that would definitely come up on the exam. It's not too difficult or too easy by any means. But the key thing here is we need to look for the pattern. And there's two key tricks that they often put in these patterns that makes them harder. Because if you look at this, we can see it goes from 4 to 5 to 8 to 10. There's not really an obvious pattern there. It increases by 1, then by 3, then by 2. Likewise, if we look down, 4, 5, 8, plus 1, plus 3, plus 11, plus minus 4, not really any clear patterns there. If we look on a diagonal, 5, 5, 8, 16, 8, 12, 10, 10, not really an obvious pattern. There's two key tricks that they often use with these patterns for the non-obvious patterns like this one. One is that there's a number of numbers which are decoy numbers, which are there just to trick you, but aren't a part of the pattern. In this case, that is not what it is. Decoy numbers, it's normally either a 0 or a 1, or it's the same number repeated. So for example, if we had this whole row was just zeros, then that would probably be decoy numbers. Or if they were all 17s, that would probably be decoy numbers. That's not what we're seeing here. The other trick is that there's a pattern jump, which means there's two separate patterns and they jump over each other. Now, some of you might have seen this right away. Some of you may not have. But if you look at this here, so I'll just scribble on screen, 4 to 8. What is that? That would be, it could be plus 4 or times by 2. That's how we could make this transformation. 5 to 10. How could we go from 5 to 10? We could add 5, or we could multiply 5 by 2. Likewise, this final one here, 8 to 16, we could add 8, or we could times it by 2. So we can see that from the first square to the third square, the first number is always multiplied by 2, which is pretty easy really. 4 by 2 gives us 8, 5 by 2 gives us 10, 8 by 2 gives us 16. That's a pretty easy pattern. Same thing then if we look at these other ones. 5 by 2 gives us 10, 16 by 2 gives us 32, and 12 by 2 gives us 24. And so we know right away that the correct answer has to be 36. Because the reality is the pattern was super simple. The numbers were just being multiplied by 2. There was just a little jump there. That's what made it hard. Now again, you could do hundreds of these questions and you wouldn't improve. But if you know what to look for, you know how to spot patterns, you know the tricks that they put in these questions, then you can get these questions right very quickly without having to do that many for practice. And so the first way to really differentiate your child is rather than just getting tutoring for maths and English in general, number one, getting tutoring where you actually learn these exam strategies so that rather than having to do thousands of practice questions and not really improve, you can do less. You can just figure out the question, you can learn the exam strategy, and you can go from taking minutes and minutes and minutes to getting it right in a short period of time. So first way your child can differentiate themselves is by learning the exam strategies. Second way is personalized support. Now this is obviously a key one. It's one that we would all understand, but it's inevitable when you're preparing for an exam like this, at some point you're going to get stuck. You're going to get stuck. You're going to find a question where you don't know how to solve it. You don't know how to figure out the strategy. And having someone you can turn to for support is really important. I know for me, when I prepared for the exam, there were some questions like these ones where I needed to speak with someone because I couldn't figure out the strategy on my own. I needed someone who could show me, okay, this is the way you go around it. This is the way you want to tackle this question. And so it's really important to have someone there who can provide you with that personalized support. So if you get stuck, you can immediately get unblocked and you can continue on in your preparation. Key thing there being that this often is one of the major things that leads to students losing motivation, because there's nothing more demotivating than when you find something too hard, you can't get help, and so you just keep trying and trying and trying and you're not really improving. And so it's really important to have help there. If you get stuck, get help right away, and then you can keep progressing in your preparation. Final one is again one that most of us would probably agree with, which is feedback. Feedback meaning a few different things. One thing is it's really important to know, how are you going? Are you on track or are you not on track? Because I know there's nothing more stressful as a student than when you're just preparing. You don't really know if you're heading in the right direction. You don't know if you're going to be at the standard you need to be by the exam day. You really want someone to just tell you, this is where you are now. This is where you need to be. Do these things for the next few weeks and then you'll be on track. It's really important to have feedback so you know how you're going. One easy way of doing this is by sitting a full mock exam right at the start of your preparation. You can identify your starting point. You can see where you're starting. Then you can track your progress over time. And ideally, before exam day, well before exam day, you're up to the standard that you need. The second way that feedback is really important is feedback on writing. Writing is one of those things where if you don't get feedback, you're probably either going to improve really slowly or not at all. So what will often happen is I'll log in, I'll see a student has submitted 6-7 essays in a space of a week, and I'll read through all of them, and they made the same mistake in every single one. And what that really means is they would have been better off not writing the final 5 to 6, just writing the first one, chatting with someone, getting some feedback, us saying, look, this is the one thing you really need to focus on. Focus on improving that for the next essay. Maybe do a little bit of practice on it beforehand. Well, let's try and get that perfected. Then we'll look at the next thing after that. That would have saved them writing the same essay and making the same mistake again and again and again and again. So for example, here with this student, this is an example of an essay that was written by someone at the start of their preparation. They're quite a strong writer now. But this one here was when they were first starting to learn structure. And at this point, their piece was structured okay, but it had a few gaps in it. So for example, in the introduction here, in an introduction to an essay, there's 3 key things that you want to do. You want to introduce the topic, because you can't assume that the reader knows what you're going to talk about. You need to introduce your stance or your opinion. What's your angle? What do you believe? And then you want to introduce your arguments. And you want them to be strong arguments. In this case here, this introduction, the structure was not quite what we're looking for. So we needed a clearer topic sentence, something like, recently, there's been increased debate as to whether zoos are important for society or whether they should be closed down. A sentence like that immediately tells the reader what you're going to be talking about. It's about this question that's been important recently. We then want a very clear sentence that explains your opinion. So zoos are important and they should not be closed down for 2 key reasons. And then you want to give your 2 reasons. So firstly, reason 1. Firstly, reason number 2. And so for this particular student, their structure is definitely not poor, but it's not quite perfect yet. And so I'd say this student here, if we went through their piece, if we looked at where they are in terms of structure compared to where they need to get to, if they focus on structure, their next essay should be pretty perfect from a structural standpoint. Yes, there's other things that could be improved. Argument strength, argument explanation, the way some of these sentences are phrased. But structure is the first thing. We could focus on that first, perfect that, and then move on. And that's really what we see with writing. There's a bit of a process for how you improve. Normally, structure is the first thing you want to master. Once you learn how to structure a piece really well, that probably gets you about a 5 out of 10. If the other areas of your piece aren't that good, if you structure it well, you're still going to get a decent score. After that, you want to iron out any punctuation, spelling, grammar errors, because if there's spelling mistakes, if there's sentences that are super long, they could be broken into 2 or 3 sentences, you will get marked down for that. So that's an easy area just to improve. Then after that, there's a few key things, which is like argument strength and argument explanation. How persuasive are your arguments? How well explained are they? They're the next things. And if you can have someone who can provide feedback to your child, or you can do it yourself, where you say, okay, first thing, structure. Let's get your structure perfect. then let's focus on this, then let's focus on this. It's going to allow them to improve a lot more quickly than if they're just writing tons of pieces and not getting feedback. And so to really kind of summarize, how can your child be in that top 15% of students and actually get a place into Melbourne High, Mac.Rob, Nossal, Suzanne, Cory, and differentiate themselves from everyone else sitting in the exam who is doing a lot of the same key things? The 3 key things are learning the exam strategies, learning the techniques and specific ways of approaching questions. That can, number 1, mean you don't have to do hours and hours of practice. You can learn how to answer them really quickly. But it can also take a question that would take most people 2, 3, 4 minutes and allow your child to solve it in about 30 seconds. Tip number 1, learn the exam strategies. Tip 2, personalized support. So having someone for your child to turn to when they get stuck, so they don't get stuck and get demotivated. They have someone who can quickly help them. They can continue on progressing in their preparation. Then finally, number 3, feedback. Both feedback on how your child's progressing overall. Are they on track? Are they doing enough? Are they progressing at the right rate? But also particularly on their writing, which really needs to be on a weekly basis. And so good luck. I look forward to hearing of your child's success and hopefully hearing of them gaining admission into one of these selective schools. If you want our help in having them get help in these 3 key areas, exam strategy, personalized support, and feedback, there's a link below this video where you can book in for a call with us and we can chat about the programs we have available. Otherwise, there's also free practice questions below this video. There's a lot of free videos on this channel which will help your child as well. And so good luck. I look forward to hearing of their success on this exam.